I had to revise my paper today on the metro on the way here because at 10:30 last night the Productivity Commission dropped its interim report on harnessing data and digital technology, and that includes a very important chapter headed, sorry, as I say, it dropped at 10:30 last night, supporting safe data access and use through outcome-based privacy regulation. And it has subheadings in it such as proposed reforms risk entrenching existing problems. Some anticipated reforms outlined in the Attorney General's recommendations could exacerbate the existing regulatory burdens. And what they come up with is something which hasn't been proposed before, which is what they call a dual-track compliance regime based on prospective outcomes. And in essence, what their idea is that when you look at the Attorney General's recommendations around reform of notice and consent, potential opt-ins for targeted advertising and so on, they look at all of that and say, in essence, this is making what is already a complex and not well understood regulatory regime even more complex and not necessarily focused on outcomes. And one response to that by various groups, including consumer groups, has been, well, okay, let's super add on top of the existing requirements an overarching requirement for uses of personal information to be fair and responsible, i.e. not only would we double down on the existing notice and consent regime, we might also introduce an opt-out regime or even an opt-in regime in respect of targeted advertising. But we would also super add a fair and reasonable requirement that overarches regardless what happens on notice and consent. Instead, the Productivity Commission says, hey, hang on a bit. We should be thinking about a dual track. And that dual track might look something like this. So an organisation could elect either to comply with the revised privacy regime based upon notice and consent, and however it might be changed after what I like to call tranche 1.5, because we'll never see tranche 2. Or they can elect to take an outcomes-based approach. And that would be based on a new concept which asks the question, is what an organisation doing in the best interests of the person concerned? Or some concept like that. And in essence, if an organisation has the confidence that they would be able to establish that what they were doing was in the best interests of the person concerned, they could elect to take a different track. They could elect to take, to comply with what they consider is in the best interests of the person concerned, and to be ready to justify that if challenged by the Privacy Commissioner, or they could comply with the notice and consent regime as it might be changed under tranche 1.5. So that in essence is a dual track regime, one track outcomes-based. Are you ready to be able to prove to the Privacy Commissioner that you meet whatever is stated to be this new best interest test that was only proposed as of 10:30 last night? Or do you elect to go down the notice and consent route? Now, that sounds very attractive for, amongst others, people engaged in digital advertising, because many of you might consider that what you're doing is in the best interests of the person concerned. You're delivering them more relevant advertising material to their interests, and maybe you're ready to go down that path and avoid having to deal with the full notice and consent regime. But one thing to pause and think about is how the tranche 1.5 track might develop if in fact that alternative is made available. And there is a risk always that when government allows a safety valve or a safe harbour, that they kind of double down on the other side and make the other side requirements even more onerous because an organisation has the choice of the safe harbour. So on the one hand, and this is where I'll sort of end my rendition of how I read this on the Metro today, on the one hand, it's very good news I wanted to bring to this gathering about the concept of best interests and outcome-based as an alternative to the very prescriptive regime that was proposed in the AG report. But on the other, it does carry the risk that that then encourages further development of the prescriptive rules on the other side. So, like all regulatory reforms, what initially sounds good may or may not be as good as it looks. So, to get back to the real presentation, two key takeaways I think Jonas said that you generally take away from a presentation. So my first key takeaway is the past is not a guide to the future. And my second takeaway is that however privacy regulation develops is not likely to be around what is the best or most appropriate form of regulation for digital advertising. It will come through pressures for reform from other areas. Privacy reform almost always happens not because a particular privacy reform has been demonstrated to be in the best interests of the public. It usually comes because there's some existential political crisis that causes the government to react. So don't think that we are necessarily in a process of trying to influence development of privacy law to be optimal for the digital advertising sector, although that is what we're trying to do. The simple reality is government will be buffeted by headwinds that are often unpredictable and cause privacy reform to head off in all sorts of strange directions. Part of the reason that we're having this discussion about what privacy law should look like, driven by the Productivity Commission, a bunch of economists, is that Australia has a productivity crisis, as we all know. And so the government is responding to an economic imperative of a broader productivity crisis across the Australian economy and fundamentally rethinking what privacy law should look like and potentially overruling what the Attorney General's Department said privacy law should look like only 2 years ago. So the world is a very unpredictable place that we live in. Of course, the other unpredictable factor in all of this is that the EU is also looking at its privacy regulation as well as AI regulation and saying, gee, have we overdone it in this space and maybe we need to simplify. And that's not just only about the pressure of Donald Trump. It is also because EU AI regulation is stupid. It's overcooked. It was developed before Gen AI came on the scene. It's completely unfit for purpose of dealing with applications of Gen AI. But you try and change the law when you've got 28 countries in the EU that need to agree on change. So the EU is not going to set the path for Australia. Donald Trump is not going to set the path for Australia because he's made it clear that his path is concerned with one thing only, make America great again. And if that means enabling global digital platforms to trample over the rest of the world, well, so be it. If that means enabling AI companies to get whatever data they like without concern as to privacy, so be it. So it's very interesting because the two sort of key jurisdictions we generally look to are not going to provide a guide to Australia. And that may mean that Australia does something quite differently and without regard, without waiting to see what the rest of the world does. So opportunities as a result of uncertainty. I mentioned before that the pressure for privacy reform comes from a lot of sources, and here is just a few of the issues that are current in the space. Tracking pixels and privacy obligations, of course we understand the Commissioner's guidance around that. Issues around alcohol and gambling, issues around dark patterns, issues around connected cars and privacy, reform of Australian consumer law around unfair trading practices which overlaps with proposals for privacy reform, and of course children's privacy. So there's many moving parts that influence where privacy law may go. So let me just perhaps refer to one moving piece that is not an Australian piece, but which I think is going to become increasingly important. And there was an article in The Economist the other week that really took my eye, called Airlines' Favourite New Pricing Trick. And I'll just read the paragraph because I'm sure all of you will get it straight away. In May, Thrifty Traveller, a website about travel bargains, reported that America's three big legacy airlines, American, Delta and United, had started charging higher per-person fares for single passenger bookings than for identical itineraries with two people. Cole Potter, the author, grumbled that the practice amounted to carriers weaponising their fares against solo travellers who can't clone themselves. Great line. Brian Kelly of The Points Guy, another travel site, called it greed getting out of control and said that the airlines were asking for government intervention. Although no airline has yet commented on the subject, Delta and United reportedly scrapped the practice amid the criticism.
Time's up, Pete.
Time's up. And the reason I raise that is that it is a classic example of how data about people, including in the context of contextual, not necessarily advertising, but contextual price personalisation, may be used contrary to the interests of the person to whom the data relates. Point one. Point two, that personalisation doesn't necessarily require you to know who that individual is. And that's a really important point because all of our privacy law today is built on the concept of a reasonably identifiable individual. And let's face it, the reason many times that clean rooms are proposed are to try and work a way through the regulatory regime to find a way to personalise to individuals without using directly information about a reasonably identifiable individual. Now, if instead you go down a track which says it's not a question of whether they are identifiable or not, but whether data is being used to individuate, to personalise the treatment of an individual, and then ask the question, was that data used in the best interest of the person concerned or contrary to their best interests? If I'm a solo traveller and I'm being offered a higher price because I'm a solo traveller, I know what I think the answer to that question is. Maybe you think the same when you're in that position. And maybe that also illustrates another point, which is the perspective of the consumer is often different to the perspective of the marketer. And as soon as you create a regime of organisational accountability for whether the outcome to the individual is in the best interests of the individual, you might lead to a very different outcome to that of current privacy law. So key point, tracking pixels may or may not be used in conjunction with a collection of use of information about a reasonably identifiable individual, even where they're not used in connection with a collection and use of information about a reasonably identifiable individual. The trends are towards looking at whether individuation is in the best interests of an individual or not. And let me end with one other example, which is a law that came into effect in New York in May of 2025, just a month or two ago. And in essence, what that law requires is that companies that use personalised algorithmic pricing are required to disclose that prices were set by an algorithm using consumer data. Specifically, prices set using such algorithms must be accompanied by the following disclosure, quote, "This price," all in large case, "this price was set by an algorithm using your personal data." So, and when you actually look at the regulation, the use of personal data is a broader concept than information about a reasonably identifiable individual. So it's not just whether it's defined personal information as we do in the Australian Privacy Act, it's that broader concept of personalisation that I was talking about. So the existential fears of individuals about AI and algorithms and how they're being used in ways that might affect them, they are starting to be an important influence in the regulatory process. Even New York is responding. You read articles every second week in the trade press around personalised pricing and fears of individuals around personalised pricing. That's going to become very relevant in this debate. Potentially, the possible Australian response of a dual track might give an alternative way of addressing this and a potential safe harbour for digital advertisers who are willing to think about the best interests of people. And potentially it gets us away from this really technical and engaged process around notice, consent, disclosures, and provides an alternative track based upon a safe harbour of best interests of people concerned. So as of 10:30 last night, the world may have changed. It depends on whether the Productivity Commission's interim recommendations are carried through as final recommendations. You now have a chance to say what you think about them before, I think, the 19th of September. And then what will the path of future privacy reform be? Well, we know that the Productivity Commission recommendations go to Jim Chalmers. Jim Chalmers has got the money, so he's more important than Michelle Rowland, the Attorney-General, who never has the money. What will this mean for what privacy reform will look like? Well, I can tell you, it won't look like what it looked like in the AGD final report. It will be tranche 1.5. It will look quite different, and I actually have no idea what it will look like, but we have a bit better idea than we had before 10:30 last night. Thank you.